Yesterday, I ran through this short story collection called Beasts and Beauty by Soman Chainani, so that's what I'll be sharing with you today. So, like I said, this was a collection of short stories, and they were all basically rewritten fairy tales. So, things like Red Riding Hood, Cinderella, Peter Pan, Snow White, um, Jack and the Beanstalk, and a lot of others that are like pretty common in popular culture, except that so all of these rewrites kind of do something different with the stories. Like that's probably the part I enjoyed most. Like none of them end or like proceed in quite the same way that the original stories did, and they were all like a little like small changes, I guess, to the setup of each tale that made it, I think, both more meaningful and also just a little bit different from the original tales. So, what are some examples? Let's see. There's Snow White, for instance, in which Snow White is actually a black woman. Like her mother was also a black woman and she married a prince in a kingdom where people are mostly white. And like before he became king, this wasn't something that mattered to him very much. But after he became king, the fact that all his subjects were really critical and suspicious of his wife sort of made him start to be kind of unsettled also. So he starts to distance himself from her. And so the queen eventually makes a wish during the winter, like when she sees this black crow that's turned white by snow, to have a child. And so Snow White is actually named like partly based upon this wish rather than on the color of her skin. And this story sort of follows this girl and explores this idea of like being loved and loving, and just her finding her own kind of strength in this world and dealing with this kind of prejudice. Let's see, another example would be Peter Pan. So the original Peter Pan story does talk a little bit about the idea that children can be cruel, I guess, and careless. And this story actually really builds on this idea that never growing up is not a good thing. So this story focuses on Wendy, who is actually growing up, like even though she returns to Neverland every now and then, and like over the course of the story, like you get Peter portrayed more as kind of the villain of the story, this boy who never grows up and never matures, and Wendy ends up falling in love with this pirate who works on Captain Hook's ship. So like all of these stories have sort of like they're what I would consider like meaning-based stories. Like they have a lot of thought, I think, put into the kind of concepts that they want to represent, and it goes into this theme that's represented in the title with like the idea of like the beast and beauty and like a lot of the conflicts between the two, and what is represented, like what we consider a beast or like things that we consider beautiful. And I think it does a pretty good job at that, but it also means that this whole collection is really serious. Like they're not really what I would consider dark fairy tales. Like there isn't a lot of like blood and gore or anything, but they are really serious, like which means that they maybe weren't necessarily like a really fun or relaxing read. Like I said, it was interesting to see what the author did with everything, but it wasn't something that I would necessarily return to much because everything was so serious. I think probably the stories that stood out most to me would be, let's see, one would be Sleeping Beauty, mostly because I think that one was the most different. Like it had a lot of little bizarre things. So for instance, Sleeping Beauty was a man, and like I think this was probably also the one with the most humor just because of like the kind of blasé way that people reacted to things, like someone being really angry, stamping the ground and falling into the floor, and like people sort of take this as oh, everyday business. And then there's like rose demons and vampires. So yeah, it was definitely probably the most different and bizarre twist on a traditional fairy tale. And then the other one that stood out for me would be The Little Mermaid. Like this entire story was based on the conversation between the mermaid and the sea witch, where the sea witch, through like a lot of really sarcastic questions and comments, is really getting at this idea or criticizing the idea that you can harbor any like feelings of deep or true love for someone with whom you have never exchanged a single word. So I think this one kind of stood out to me because it really goes into some of the concepts of like love at first sight and stuff that I've always found really unbelievable, I suppose. So yeah, overall kind of a pretty interesting collection. I read all the stories in it, and I think they all left their own kind of impression. Not particularly light reading, but definitely interesting.